When I say the name Flint, Michigan, only one image likely springs into your mind. Bathtubs filled with brown and yellow water, the disgusting soup turfed out of the city's own fresh water supply. But as you can see, there's absolutely nothing fresh about that shit. This was once a proud industrial city full of purpose and culture and life. But even amidst its modern decline, what the city had left has also been taken away. This wasn't just some random single incident in a far-flung corner of the US either. It was allowed to go on for months upon months, and when it was finally brought into light, it was covered up. People lost their hair, they got sick, they died. And the worst part is it was completely avoidable. This, today, is the story of how a state poisoned its people and the lasting trauma that left behind. Just before we continue today, quick word from our lovely sponsor, Surfshark. Look, if you've ever used public Wi-Fi, you know it can be a bit of an open door for anyone who wants to snoop on your data. If you're using a Wi-Fi and it doesn't have a password protection thing, or just in general, like any public Wi-Fi, and you're not using a VPN, like Surfshark VPN, today's sponsor, it's just a little too risky. It's a little bit dodgy, isn't it? Surfshark VPN eliminates that risk. It encrypts everything you do online, your browsing, your searches, all of the sites you visit, so no one can track you. You can also change your virtual location with a simple click, which unlocks content from other countries. Think streaming shows, region-locked news, even lower flight prices. It's one account for unlimited devices, so you can run it on your laptop, your phone, your tablet, whatever you use. And since your connection is secure, you don't have to worry about shady Wi-Fi at airports, hotels, or coffee shops. Fantastic! Go to surfshark.com/places or use the code PLACES at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. And now back to today's episode. Welcome to the great state of Michigan. Located north in its 2 famous parts split by the Mackinac Straits, what people understand here as loyalty, waterside living, and freezing cold winters. Michigan actually borders 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, and a 5-mile-long bridge connects its southern section to its northern one. Michigan has the longest freshwater coastline of any state in the Union, with over 3,000 miles of fresh stuff lining the various beaches. Here we have some absolutely great and historic cities like Grand Rapids in the southwest and Detroit in the southeast. As many of you might already know, Detroit was once one of the richest and most vibrant industrial cities in the United States, at the heart of the automotive industry. Nowadays, it's looking a little ropier, and you can check out our video on the various problems there if you'd like to know more. The reason that we bring up Detroit is because if you travel up I-75 northwest, you will hit the great city of Flint and its 80,000 or so residents. Flint has a good location nearby to a lot of the lakes and sits on the corner between the previously mentioned I-75 as well as I-69. The other reason we bring it up is that, very much like Detroit, Flint has had its day. The manufacturing and steel production that once supported the US automobile industry in Detroit mostly dried up after the 1980s. Most blue-collar work ended up getting offshored, gutting communities in the city and contributing to high levels of poverty. Between 1980 and 2013, the median income declined by more than 40% in real terms. In that same period, the city shrank by 40,000 people. In early 2014, only 11% of the population had a bachelor's degree, and almost 13% of persons younger than 65 were without health insurance. All of that is to say, it's a lot like other cities of yesteryear in former industrial Americana. Disinvestment, unemployment, violence, poverty, gangs, depopulation, racism, and food insecurity are just some of the crises going on here on any given day. But the most significant crisis that tore through the population here only happened as recently as 2014, and it has left an entire community irreparably changed by its events. And it came from the one place you'd never expect, because it was already all around them: the water. So this whole mess started back in April of 2014. Tumblr was still popular, President Obama was still in office, and Russia had just invaded Crimea. The world was a pretty busy place, but as Happy by Pharrell Williams was drummed into everybody's brains so much that it was driving us all insane, other events in Flint were quietly taking place. On April the 25th, 2014, Flint's drinking water source was changed from Lake Huron, provided by the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, or DWSD, to the Flint River. This was a temporary switch as part of a broader plan for Flint to build its own pipeline, connecting it to the Karaganondi Water Authority, or KWA. City Council meeting minutes reportedly estimated that around $200 million could be saved over a span of 25 years by doing this. But whilst the financial implications would be positive for the city's checkbook, it would prove to be disastrous for the health of its residents. You see, switching to the Flint River only needed minimal costs. They could shut down the pipeline to Lake Huron and save a lot of money that way as they slowly built a new one. The pipes connecting the city to the Flint River already existed. Sure, they were a little bit old, with the majority of them built in the early to mid-20th century, but they'd be perfectly serviceable as a stopgap option that would save the state some money. The citizens, they barely even notice, right? Well, no, not quite. You see, there was a problem with the Flint River's pipes, as well as with the bureaucracy that was overseeing them. And here is where we meet the first villain of today's story, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Think of them like a whole EPA, but just for Michigan. There are laws in the US that freshwater providers have to follow to make sure that it's safe to drink, and the MDEQ were the organization who had to make sure that that was the case in Michigan. And they had quite the challenge on their hands. Many of the Flint River's old pipes connected to the distribution system and the water treatment plant were made from lead, which had even more important regulations because lead poisoning is, and you're not going to believe this, it's quite bad for you. Now, this isn't much of an issue in theory. Lead service lines are still used all over the world today, but an absolutely crucial balance has to be struck in how they're operated. If you're going to use lead pipes, the water that flows through it has to be treated according to US law. Now, drinking water is treated for the most part anyway, so this is usually not a problem. Various facilities take out the sediment, the bacteria, everything else that can make you sick, ensuring that you get some lovely fresh water. And on top of that, some protective elements are added too. These line the inside of the lead pipes with an anti-corrosive coating which stops the lead from leaching into the water. Such chemicals, like orthophosphate, are known as corrosion control chemicals, and they do their job pretty well. After all, attached to the treatment plant in Flint was an aging distribution network of old lead water pipes. It leaked occasionally, it was fragile, unreliable, and there were some corrosion issues, but even with almost century-old pipes in some areas, Flint's drinking water was considered up until April 2014 to be totally safe. The water which came from Lake Huron was treated properly and it was stable, so the lead below Flint just wasn't an issue. But the Flint River, that's a rather different story. The city chose to switch the water source from one of the largest freshwater sources in the world to the river of a former local industrial hub. It's safe to say that the water was just a smidge worse in terms of quality, with more chemicals and other industrial pollution throughout. Now, don't get me wrong. When the switch was made in April 2014, Flint's government were treating the water with things like chlorine and various agents to control algae and bacteria levels, and that's important. But they didn't include the corrosion prevention control. And here's what happened. Now, the EPA have a role in environmental law known as the lead and copper rule, which requires you to add those anti-corrosion chemicals to line pipes made from, well, you guessed it, copper and lead. The MDEQ knew about the rule, but crucially, they misinterpreted it. They believed that the city did not need the corrosion control straight away. Instead, that a testing phase under a wait-and-see approach was acceptable. This, Flint claimed at the time, allowed them to have 2 6-month testing periods before deciding if corrosion control was needed in the water. But for a system the size of Flint's, that was just straight up wrong. This much lead needed that corrosion control, or things were going to go bad and quickly. But the MDEQ told the city the wrong thing to do, and so the switch was made to the Flint River without any corrosion prevention being implemented. And almost immediately, the effects would start to be felt. Even before the temporary switch to Flint's own river water, residents expressed concerns about its quality. The Flint City Council released a statement on the day of the switch to address this, stating, quote, "Even with a proven track record of providing perfectly good water for Flint, there still remains lingering uncertainty about the quality of the water. In an effort to dispel myths and promote the truth about the Flint River and its viability as a residential water source, there have been numerous studies and tests conducted on its water by several different independent organizations." End quote. They leaned on the clout of the MDEQ. Of course, soon nobody would trust a word uttered by that organization, but for now, the city held firm. Quote, "Michael Prisby of the Michigan DEQ Office of Drinking Water verified that the quality of the water being put out meets all of our drinking water standards, and Flint water is safe to drink." End quote. Yet concerns and tensions started to rise fast. As early as May, so less than a month into the switch, a resident by the name of Brandon Gillian had described seeing mud-colored water spout from his faucet at home. This would soon be the image people remembered of Flint. Not the proud industrial history, not the cultural impact of the city, the discolored water. The more corrosive river water had no anti-corrosion agents in it, causing it to wear on the old lead pipes from the inside, which quickly leached into the water entering people's homes. Flint residents were already at an increased risk for lead exposure because of older and deteriorated housing stock alongside a track record of poor nutrition, and soon that risk would be sent into overdrive. More and more people started to complain of a foul taste and smell. People were breaking out in rashes, others were losing their hair. However, it wouldn't be until mid-August, over 3 months since the switch, before Flint City Council would act. And it wasn't even anything to do with the lead. On August the 14th of 2014, it was recommended for the first time that residents of Flint boil their water before consumption. This was because the water was found to contain the bacterium E. coli. A great track record for them so far. But the MDEQ stated it had dealt with the issue by adding more chlorine to the water when treating it. Of course, what they were doing was like putting a band-aid over a venomous snake bite as the poison seeped into people's homes. In fact, boiling the water would later be found to actually increase the levels of lead in the water as it became more concentrated. Then a huge red flag would come from the very industry that propped up the city. General Motors was one of the few American automotive companies still operational in this part of the country, and in October of 2014, they announced that they would stop using the Flint water because they were afraid it was going to corrode their machines. Take a look at this picture of 2 formerly identical nails. The top one was exposed to Detroit water for a month. The bottom one was exposed to Flint's for a month. The difference pretty damn clear. And yet the Flint City Council and MDEQ continued to claim that this was safe to put in people's bodies. If it could corrode machine parts, what would it do to a person's internal organs? People were getting sicker, and yet the message seemed to be getting through to people painfully slowly, mainly because the council was contradicting what people saw in their own homes. There was something wrong with the water. People were starting to notice. As the new year came and went into 2015, some early tests of Flint's water were starting to see results. Flint was found on the second day of the year to be in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. It was because of the lead? No, of course it wasn't. It was because of the level of total trihalomethanes in the water. These are disinfection byproducts that occur when chlorine interacts with organic matter in the water, and some of them are possible carcinogens for humans. Just another ingredient thrown in the deadly soup, apparently. At this time, the state started to buy bottled water for its employees and government officers. If that doesn't tell you that they knew something was up, I don't know what does. Progress, though, wouldn't be heard on the water, however, until the end of February 2015, when a resident named Leanne Walters had the water in her home tested for lead. It was found to contain 104 parts per billion. The federal EPA's limit for drinking water is 15 parts per billion, a boundary that Flint had blown past by over 6 times. For the record, no level of lead in water is considered safe, but having 6 times the limit definitely is not. Leanne Walters' test was announced on Michigan radio, and soon the crisis would make itself fully known. 10 entire months after it started. Now, it wasn't just the work of Walters that helped bring the lead problem into the public consciousness. There were other whistleblowers and difference makers that really helped to make what was happening public. Take the University of Virginia Tech, for example, which did further tests on the water and concluded that the levels of lead were seriously dangerous. Meanwhile, a separate study by Hurley Medical Center found elevated blood lead levels in children under 5. But Michigan state legislature continued to bat off the criticism. Even when an internal EPA memo stated concern about Leanne Walters' home was leaked, Brad Werfel from MDEQ made a comment, quote, "Let me start here. Anyone who is concerned about lead in the water in Flint can relax." End quote. The reality couldn't be further from the truth. And that Hurley medical test about children under 5 with significant levels of lead in their blood, Angela Minikutsi, a spokeswoman for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, attributed it to predictable seasonal changes. Ah, yes. The well-known lead season. It would end up being October of 2015 before any crucial action was taken in relation to the levels of lead in the water when the Genesee County Board of Commissioners and the Genesee County Health Department declared a public health emergency, advising residents of Flint not to drink the municipal water. By mid-October, somebody finally suggested the sensible thing to switch the water source back to Lake Huron that cities like Detroit were using, and funding was authorized to make it happen. But the damage was already done by this point. We're talking roughly 18 months from the initial switch. Remember when we told you that health complications were being recognized as soon as May 2014? Well, it only got a hell of a lot worse since. In total, 140,000 people were thought to have been exposed to contaminated water throughout not just Flint, but the wider Genesee County. People had been poisoned for a year and a half. So how sick were they getting? How bad was it? So what kind of public health crisis are we looking at here? Now, officially, the crisis caused 12 people to lose their lives and a further 90 to become seriously unwell. Although it is believed that reports of illness and death may well have been underreported or misreported as other things. For example, during this time, a frontline investigation found that there were 115 additional deaths of Flint residents and its surrounding area from pneumonia during the swapped period. Some claim this could have been caused by undiagnosed Legionnaire's disease, as the bacteria that causes it can come from water. If so, this could have directly come from the unclean Flint River water, which we already know had the bacteria E. coli in it. But the crisis was so widespread in Flint, even those numbers could be considered an undercount. There was so much lead in Flint's water that almost any comorbidity could have been exacerbated at the time by the increased pollution. How many people have died due to the water crisis basically amounts to where you draw a line. 66% of households reported one or more adult members experiencing at least one behavioral health issue more than usual, with that number being 54% for children. Within just Flint itself, that would amount to thousands of people, with 51% of households feeling like at least one member's health had gotten worse because of the crisis. 34% of individuals self-reported symptoms of anxiety, and 29% reported symptoms of depression during the crisis, according to numbers published by the CDC. And some people's physical and mental health was severely damaged by the crisis in a number of ways. Take Flint resident Ashley Hart-Gillian, for example. She was pregnant at the time, but miscarried in a case that is believed to be connected to the water. Ashley herself is adamant of the water's impact. When women are exposed to lead before or during pregnancy, their risk of giving birth prematurely increases, as does the risk of miscarriage and having a low birth weight baby. And that mental strain on top of the physical one was proving to be significant. A study published in 2022 found that almost a quarter of adults in Flint suffered from PTSD, likely in part to have been contributed to by the water crisis. Despite such a severe mental health crisis in the city years after the water crisis, only 34.8% of respondents reported ever being offered mental health services to assist with concerns or problems associated with the water crisis. For many, the city simply moved on when their trauma didn't. A survey of just under 2,000 residents showed that almost all of them had made significant changes to their classic behaviors, the poisoned water forcing people to alter their lifestyles to avoid exposure. 78% of people reported avoiding drinking water. 91.8% avoided cooking with it, and even 47% of people avoided bathing with it. And over 3/4 of people had to pay out of pocket to lower their risk. Over 30% of people paid in excess of $1,000 to help reduce their exposure. In a city like Flint, racked with poverty, that's a significant amount of money for people. 3.7% had to pay in excess of $10,000 just to render their homes safer. But anyone who needed to pay that much and couldn't just had to live with it. All that money spent by others would be somewhat in vain too, as roughly 3/4 of residents believed that their own health or their family's health was affected adversely by exposure to contaminated water. Over 80% were concerned that health effects could be long-term. Many were worried about their kids and how it would affect them growing up. So this is a huge proportion of the population of a metropolitan area worried about their health, and despite everything, it still took 18 months to switch the water back to Lake Huron. Even worse, however, might be the impacts that the lead water had upon local children and young people. A 2022 study by Cornell University found that 25% of the children in all of Flint are now diagnosed with 7 times the national average of lead in the blood. Among low-income children, the rates are even higher. Many of the residents made their own choices in difficult circumstances at the time of 2014 and 2015 as adults, but children were essentially forced to live in these conditions and suffer the consequences of unsafe water. And they would also feel those consequences the most, as they would have to live with such complications the longest of anybody, as you can see from a study coming out 7 years after the crisis even happened. Children with elevated blood lead levels are more likely to experience impaired cognition, learning delays, hyperactivity, emotional agitation, depression, skin rashes, speech and hearing impediments, and delayed puberty. These are things that can massively mess with a child's early development. But don't just take it from us. Just look at the numbers. Test scores dropped for 3rd to 8th graders, particularly in maths. Meanwhile, the number of students with special educational needs rose by 8% following the crisis. Dana Brown is now in her mid-20s, but was only in high school during the Flint water crisis. She tested positive for lead poisoning like many other kids, but also then developed both ADHD and dyslexia, both of which are thought to be directly related to the levels of lead in her blood. These were real impacts on real vulnerable people that, for the most part, just seemed to get ignored at the time. Whilst people got sick and died, the MDEQ and Flint Council pretended like it simply wasn't happening until it was too big for everyone to ignore anymore. Heads had to roll for this. There had to be a response so that people could be compensated for the health that they had lost. But would it mean justice? It wouldn't be until December of 2015 when Flint Mayor Karen Weaver was forced to declare a state of emergency, vowing to fix the crisis once and for all. When a crisis is eventually considered to be actually happening, the dominoes tend to fall pretty quickly, as another emergency would be declared on January the 5th of 2016 by Michigan State Governor Rick Snyder, but this time over the whole of Genesee County. Soon after, President Obama would do the same in order to give Michigan access to federal disaster relief funding. Why the speed of action couldn't have happened in May of 2014 is difficult to say. At some point, Flint and the MDEQ must have recognized that their choices had made plenty of people seriously unwell, and whether it was them waiting for more evidence to come to light, wanting to cover their tracks, or if they straight up just didn't know any better, is unknown. But the response when it finally came was swift. The EPA even ended up issuing an emergency order over the crisis. In February, Governor Snyder testified before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. In his opening statement, he said, quote, "This was a failure of government at all levels, local, state, and federal officials. We all failed the families of Flint." So at least the country's leaders had finally recognized that there was a major problem in Flint. That's step one to solving any crisis. But the second step is a lot harder. It's actually doing something about it. You see, the lead that was leached into the water of Flint did so for the better part of a year and a half. During that time, a lot of people were exposed to harmful contaminants, and they would continue to feel the effects of these contaminants for years to come, maybe even their entire lives. The water was swapped back to Lake Huron, and the treated water traveling through the pipes would have helped bring the crisis event itself to an end. But residents of Flint would continue to bear the brunt. The response was pretty total, though. Congress helped establish a federal advisory committee on Flint, enhanced childhood lead poisoning prevention program activities, and supported a voluntary Flint lead exposure registry. The registry, funded through a grant to Michigan State University, was designed to identify eligible participants, record data, and monitor the health of individuals in the registry. It was designed to monitor people's health, as they would likely have more complications throughout their lives, and it would plan to improve service delivery for the victims. It also kept track of child development to look at those educational outcomes that we shared with you earlier, all the while keeping an eye on further lead exposure risks and coordinating with other community programs so that people could get the care that they needed. The registry's main plan was to make Flint lead-free and to share best practices with other communities. And that's all well and good, but the damage had already been done. People were suffering, and lawmakers had to make sure people were held to account, make sure that victims were compensated, and make sure new legislation came in that would stop this from ever happening again. Tighter state standards around monitoring and transparency would come within the state itself. Meanwhile, the Lead and Copper Rule, as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act, would be revised federally to push more frequent testing and to eventually get rid of lead service lines across the country for good. And yet, it still seemed to come with a healthy dose of cover-up in the aftermath. In mid-2016, another Virginia Tech test concluded that the water remained unsafe to drink without a filter. In response to this, Governor Rick Snyder vowed to drink filtered Flint water for the next 30 days in a bid to reassure the residents it was safe. But there is no record of whether he actually did this. My money would be on him not. President Obama even had a sip in 2016 to prove it was safe, whether it was or not. The whole response, despite recognizing the scope of the problem, seemed intent on sweeping the issue quickly under the rug and moving on. But the response had to be more than community funding and revised laws. You can't sweep water under a rug. People were ultimately responsible for this public health crisis, and they needed to be held accountable. So, It's a positive thing that in April of 2016, criminal charges were filed against MDEQ state officials. Those charged include Stephen Bush and Michael Prisby, as well as Flint's water quality supervisor, Michael Glasgow. The charges included misconduct, neglect of duty, and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. Then in July, 6 more individuals who were current and former state employees also had criminal charges filed against them for misconduct in office, conspiracy, and willful neglect of duty. But overall, convictions for anybody who was caught up in the whole thing were pretty rare. It was difficult to lay blame at anybody's feet because the system had failed Flint rather than any specific person. And as with all questions of collective responsibility, blame was shared and watered down to the point of meaninglessness, all while people's lives were irreparably changed for the worse or even ended prematurely. The cynical among you might recognize the low levels of convictions as just another example of the attitude the powers that be had toward the crisis as a whole. Lots of good work was done to prevent further harm in the future, but what about those still facing harm today? Where was their closure? Well, that would come in the form of a civil lawsuit. It wasn't about money, it was about principle. These people's lives had been messed with, and that had to be acknowledged. Finally, in December 2020, Flint City Council approved a $20 million insurance settlement for residents impacted by the Flint water crisis. It was important for the city itself to recognize its own culpability in the mess that it ultimately caused. Mayor Sheldon Neely stated the settlement, quote, "No amount of money will ever repair the damage done by the Flint water crisis, but this $20 million from our insurance company is an important step forward, and it will directly, positively benefit the adults, children, and businesses impacted." This $20 million settlement was the City of Flint's contribution to a total $626 million settlement led by the state of Michigan and any companies involved in the switch to Flint's river water. This aimed to cover the entirety of personal injuries, property damage, and business losses. Nearly 80% of these funds were allocated to individuals aged under 18 at the time of the crisis, so they could take back some of the future that was ripped from them. So where does that leave Flint today? Well, in reality, the water crisis has been a long-running saga, not just the 18 months that the lead was getting into people's water. The residents continue, as they have for over a decade now, struggling in a poor city with poor infrastructure that led to this mess in the first place. Those who have adverse health effects struggle to live with the way their lives have changed and wonder what could have been if the lead had never come to Flint. The saddest thing about it all was that the Flint water crisis was totally avoidable. It was born out of a desire to save money, but the council's choices put the health of the very people they were supposed to govern in jeopardy. If the MDEQ had more competent personnel, if those on the council had bothered to ask the right questions, if area's lawmakers didn't try to minimize the scale of the crisis at every opportunity, Flint could have a greater American legacy than the city that poisoned its own people. But say Flint, Michigan today, and all anyone can remember is that brown water. And to a certain degree, that's useful. It will ensure that the crisis stays alive in people's memories for many years to come, hopefully avoiding these issues in the future. But for the people of Flint to be constantly reminded of the disastrous effect it had on communities, it may well feel like a nightmare that they can't wake up from. Thank you for watching.